Seemingly overnight, we find ourselves in a world impacted by the open source movement. From the smartphones we use, to the cars we drive, and the modern spacecraft bringing us to Mars, open source is just about everywhere we look. But who are the people driving these innovations to improve how we live? Hi, I'm Jay Garcia, and we launched this series to highlight the innovators in the open source community. We begin our journey with Andreas Herrmann. Andreas is a consultant in the Scalable Builds team at Tweag. Andreas is also a mentor and an open source contributor for Bazel, a multi-platform and extensible build and test system. Bazel is developed by Google and provides fast, reproducible software builds. Bazel is used all over the world and includes companies like Google, Adobe, and Dropbox. Welcome to Pioneers in Open Source. Welcome, Andreas, to the show. I'm very excited to talk to you about all the things that you're doing in the Bazel community. How would you introduce Bazel itself to anyone who is not aware of it?
It's a build system. So, if you have a project where you need to compile your code to then have a binary that you can run of some sort, then you'd want to organize the steps that need to be taken to make that happen, right? You have your different modules, you need to compile them into objects, you need to link them together, all that kind of stuff. And so the type of tool that manages these workflows is a build system. So classical ones that most people would probably know are things like Make. And Bazel is such a system, but it aims to support very large code bases, and it aims to support polyglot code bases, and it aims to support large teams of people working on code. And so it has advanced features to make that happen. It has aggressive caching features, for example, to make sure that you avoid unnecessary work, or it can scale your build on a remote execute cluster so that your laptop is not the only resources you have available. You can sort of scale it up. The use case it comes out of is Google, right? So their internal build system, Blaze, they decided to open source it at some point in 2015. I believe they hit the button, and they called it Blaze. They called it Bazel in the open source version, but yeah, it's grown out of what Google needed in their build system.
How did you get introduced to Bazel?
The first time I really started working with it was at Tweag. I actually had heard about it before I joined Tweag. At the time, I was very excited about Nix, the package manager. I guess that's perhaps something that will also require an introduction. But it sort of has somewhat related ideals and principles. I started working on Bazel in Tweag. First, I was working at a project that was a research project for a distributed file system meant for exascale compute clusters, so like very large high-performance compute clusters where you need to worry about things like hardware failures not happen every once in a blue moon, but sort of on a regular basis daily. And so the kinds of algorithms you need to manage your storage are different than what you would need in smaller applications. And that project was written in Haskell. But there were a few other components to it, and we were managing different kinds of tests and generating diagrams of executions of algorithms, of the distributed algorithms. And so the native build tools that were available started not working so well anymore. The build was too slow, unreliable. And so we introduced Bazel in that project, and it was the first time I worked with it actively. And then afterwards, I got onto a client project to help them migrate a Haskell and Scala and a little bit of everything else project from. It was a mix of actually Buck, which is sort of Facebook's version of Bazel at the time, and SBT, which is a popular Scala build system. And yeah, it was a migration from those tools to Bazel at the time. Yeah.
Open source is at the heart of both Modus and Tweag alike, and so many organizations around the world. What types of areas do you actually contribute to when it comes to the Bazel open source community?
There are a couple places where we contribute. One is we have a couple Bazel extensions. So Bazel is designed to be extensible. That comes in with it, like focus on the polyglot use cases, that you can manage different languages with the build system. And so it's extensible in a language called Starlark. It's pretty much Python stripped down a bit. Yeah, we have a couple Bazel extensions, rule sets they're called, because sort of you define custom build rules. And there we have rules Haskell, which is an extension to support building Haskell code with Bazel. We have rules Nix packages, which is an extension to import packages from the Nix package manager into a Bazel project. And then we have rules sh, which is a smaller extension to provide standard shell tools in a hermetic and reproducible way. And then other areas where we contribute, Bazel itself is an open source project. It's managed by Google, as you said. But we have gotten a few contributions into Bazel. And then sort of the community around it. So we write blog posts, are active on the Bazel community Slack to answer questions. And also are present at conferences like the upcoming BazelCon, or earlier this year we helped organize Bazel Exchange as well.
Nix continues to come up in this conversation, and when I looked at Nix for the first time, I saw build system, operating system. What exactly is this thing? So how would you explain what Nix is to those who have never heard about it before?
It's a couple of things, as you say. So I think what it is to most people is a package manager that you can use to, install libraries, tools, whatever you need really. And there is also a Linux distribution called NixOS that uses that package manager to manage its packages and also its configuration and so on. And Nix comes with its own configuration language, also called Nix. I guess that's where part of the confusion comes from. There are a lot of things within Nix that are all called Nix, which makes it a little bit puzzling at times. And yeah, what it's doing is it's taking purely functional programming ideals and applies them to software management. So when you say, I have a package, then very often to actually build that package, you need some dependencies, like a compiler tool chain, maybe some libraries, some other stuff. And then when you actually build that package, what you get out is some sort of artifact, some shared object or header files or whatever. And what it says is, let's look at this build process as a pure function. So we have our dependencies as arguments to that function, and then the result of that function is the build package. It's a little bit more complicated in practice, in the sense that what the functional language actually describes, what the running of that function produces, is kind of a build script, which is then executed to actually build the package. So there's a little bit more to it, but in principle, that's the idea. Building a package should only depend on the things that we declare as input. It shouldn't depend on anything else. So if you rebuild it tomorrow with the same versions of dependencies as inputs and the same precise versions of dependencies as inputs, then the result should be the same. Yeah, so that follows the functional programming, purely functional programming principles.
Reproducible builds is something that we see happen often in our client base, and it's something that I saw as a value add when it comes to Tweag services. So what is, from your perspective, the reason why reproducible builds is becoming such an important thing?
I think there are a couple parts to it. So there is something about being able to verify that a build artifact actually comes out of a given set of sources, right? This can become pretty important if you have very sensitive software that you need to deploy to some, embedded devices or some security critical application or something like this. We really need to be able to make sure that the thing that's running is actually the thing that came out of those sources. And if your builds are actually precisely reproducible, then you can do these kinds of verifications in a way where you build it here, you hash the result, you get a number, you build it there, you hash the result, it's the same number. So you don't have to have some trusted person always babysitting the actual deployment process to make sure that nobody fudges anything. You can just use numbers in the end to verify these things. So that's one aspect. And then there are also practical implications to this where if semantically the same code produces the same artifact, then changes that are really non-changes, like perhaps adding a comment to explain something better or something like this, rebuilding is still going to produce the same artifact. A build system that's smart about caching can use this to cut the build short at this point, called early cutoff in build systems, and then avoid unnecessary work afterwards. And I mean, the same is then true if you have something where some transitive dependency changed, it had to be rebuilt, and now your thing has to be rebuilt as well because one of its dependencies changed. But then it didn't actually change anything in a meaningful way, so now your project or your component still produces the same output, and then you can cut the build short. So it just enables more aggressive caching as well. So there is also a very pragmatic benefit there. Even in cases where maybe the security aspects are not so important.
How would you describe how you got into computers, and then we'll transition that into how you got into open source?
My dad was into programming, and so he showed me some things he had done in BASIC and Pascal at the time. Some of these, at the time it was DOS graphics and so on, but there were like Mandelbrot set computations or these little population games or stuff like that. So that was my early entry into getting interested with computers. Then I got really interested in like just games on DOS and game editors in particular. I had a Sokoban at the time where you had a level editor, and I really enjoyed that kind of thing. So then I wanted to go into game programming for a long time. So I toyed around a little bit with that on the side of school. I was lucky that I got access to out-of-school programming classes in like Delphi at the time, and then later on started learning a bit of C++. So that was always something that I found very interesting from early on.
The idea that you got into video game programming, I think, is remarkable. Video games for me was one of the reasons why I got into technology. It has always been my dream to work on video games, and I'm grateful that Modus has afforded me the opportunity to do so. And I think once I grow up, I one day want to learn and be proficient at 6502 assembly to be able to produce games for the Nintendo 8-bit home console. It's the video game console I grew up playing, and I love the idea of learning the nuts and bolts of a computer system and being able to write software all the way down to counting clock cycles. And as it was called in the Atari 2600 days, when you have to race the beam. Open source for me has been a huge boom for my own career. It became part of how I decided to work. I adopted the open source principles, and I know that we created Modus out of the open source world and the open source way of thinking, and likewise Tweag was also born out of open source. How did you get started with open source?
Early on, I think mostly on the consuming side of it, so to speak, benefiting from what's available out there. So with the whole game programming thing, for example, there were game engines and so on that were open source that you could just use. Or you could find games out there and then play with them, tinker with them, modify them. I got interested in Linux as well towards the end of my school time, high school time. And with that, of course, there was a lot of the open source philosophy and so on that I read about and got really interested in. But contributing, I really started, code-wise contributing, more intensely later on in university. First a little bit through the work that I was doing, I ended up doing computational physics in uni and was contributing a little bit here and there. But someplace where I started to contribute more was when I encountered Nix then at the time, because I found that Nix made it really, really easy to contribute packages. Like if you encountered something that you wanted to build with Nix to have it available for yourself. Before that, I was using SUSE, I was using Ubuntu, various distributions, and I had tried building packages with a proper package descriptions and formats and so on, but I just found it really, really hard to do that and contribute something. But with Nix, I just found it so easy to contribute back because the whole thing is built around a Git repository where you can just contribute whenever you want. So that's where I sort of started really contributing much more code myself.
How has the open source community and the open source way of working influenced how you are in your professional life?
So I think something that's important with open source is to be open about the things you do and sort of document them early on. Create issues up front and describe what you're planning to do and let others be informed. Also to avoid wasted effort, right? Like if someone else had the same idea and they don't see any activity anywhere and they start working, now you have two people doing the same thing. Trying to organize, work around that. So, for example, when I'm starting a new client project, then in the beginning I try to document all the things that might be relevant if someone else joins the project. Like, what are the goals of this project? Who are the people involved? What are their goals? Where are the various resources that are important? Sort of write that all up and make it accessible somewhere. I think that's perhaps a way it influenced my way of working. Yeah.
Contributing to open source communities has a wide range of activities. I always tell folks you could get started by documenting certain features or perhaps writing a blog article, sharing knowledge. What would be some ideas you could give to young professionals or young engineers about their first contributions? How would you encourage them to contribute to open source?
Some things that I was doing early on outside of contributing code was, for example, I was really into Linux and playing around with various tools you could install and configuring your system and so on. And at university, it was something that for many people was a completely new thing that they now had to learn in order to pass their classes. And so there were some clubs to sort of help newcomers learn how to use Linux. So that's one way, for example, just help people find in your area, find some group of people that is there to help newcomers and share your knowledge there. Another thing is community. So around the Haskell community, I'm based in Zurich, and there we have a meetup and a annual kind of hackathon conference type event. It's like a few talks, but then it's also a space where people can work together on projects. And when I got interested in Haskell, I found this meetup community in Zurich and started showing up regularly, gave a talk. And then over time, it turned out that there was help needed in organizing some of these things. So for a while, I took over organizing the meetup itself. So there are lots of ways to contribute to a community, I think, that don't have to be directly technical contributions. But then obviously, if you have something where you see an issue you need solved for yourself or whatever, then just fixing it and contributing that fix is always a good way to get involved. Yeah.
That's part of what drives me as an open source contributor. The idea that you feel like you're a sense of something, you feel like you're part of something special. As human beings, we are tribal beings. So the idea that you're allowing yourself to be a part of a tribe, and the fact that it's a global tribe in many cases is very exciting. I've met so many people from around the globe, including yourself, who don't live close to me. And the idea that we can communicate and share ideas and help each other grow and further the open source movement, I just find is a magical thing, and it feels very much like a higher calling.
It's amazing what's possible now that we can talk across the globe in no time and with no noticeable delay. And also when it comes to that meetup, that's something that we noticed during the COVID times when meeting up in a physical location became difficult. Then we moved the events online for a while. And especially in the beginning, it was a really nice experience because all of a sudden we had such a wider reach when it came both to speakers but also to attendees. So we had all of a sudden people join in from literally across the globe to be part of these events. So yeah, that was a nice aspect to the whole situation. Unfortunately, it didn't last too long after about, I don't know, half a year or so. People sort of just started getting tired of only online meetings. It's important to still see people in person. So that was a bit of a detractor to that whole thing. But yeah, there was a very positive side.
That sense of community is what makes Tweag and Modus so special. You can't foster a culture of innovation with beer in the office, video games, scooters, and a collection of demotivational posters. How would you describe how open source itself has influenced such a rich culture at Tweag?
Yeah, I think it's a big driver for many people that join Tweag. So if I ask candidates what got them interested in the company, why they want to join, it's very often our involvement in one of the open source communities where we're very active in, be it Nix, be it Haskell, be it something else. Yeah, the blog is usually something that people are very excited about, sort of us sharing ideas, things we figured out how to do, or just stories of how we achieved certain things. Yeah, being so present in these communities and contributing upstream, also being present at events or sometimes helping organize them. Yeah, I think that drives a lot of people. First of all, to notice Tweag, but then also to want to be part of it because they see, if I work there, I get to contribute back to these communities. I think that motivates a lot of people.
That sense of purpose, I think, is a huge driver when it comes to just being a part of such a global community. And I thank you for your contributions, dude. For those who are intrigued about learning more about you, how would they get in touch with you? How do they get a chance to learn more about you?
I guess the best way is to see what I wrote on the Tweag blog. There are a couple blog posts. My GitHub. Yeah, GitHub is probably the place where I'm most visible in what I do day to day. Yeah.
Fantastic. We'll make sure to put the relevant links in the description below the video. For the engineers out there who are interested in learning more about joining you and Tweag, how do we get started?
In Tweag, we have what we call the Scalable Builds group, which is a group of people focused on build systems, and Nix plus Bazel is sort of our strongest focus. And we're hiring at the moment, so take a look at our careers page on the Tweag website. And we also have a blog post from a few months ago where we introduce sort of what this group is all about, our goals and what we work on. So take a look at that, and yeah, if you're interested, then do reach out.
Andreas, I really appreciate the time today. I learned a ton about what you do at Tweag. I learned a ton about Bazel as well as Nix. Thank you very much for the time, dude.
Thank you, Jay. It's always a pleasure talking, and yeah, thank you for having me. And yeah, looking forward to see you at BazelCon as well.